Monday, we're going to talk about the reproduction of flowering plants. And with that reproduction, there's quite a bit of new terminology. And we've been working from this very general life cycle of a plant. And so I just want to walk through a few details of the life cycle that we're going to focus on. First, we're going to talk about the multicellular gametophyte and the multicellular sporophyte. There are two key phases in any alternation of generations or diplontic life cycle, and we refer to these as the gametophyte and the sporophyte. The gametophyte is always haploid and multicellular, and the sporophyte is always diploid and multicellular. And then there's this alternation between that haploid phase and the diploid phase. To go from diploid to haploid, we have to use meiosis, but for all of the other transitions, we use mitosis. Each of the phases are named based on the structures that they produce. So the sporophyte makes spores, and the gametophyte makes gametes. One thing to notice is that sporophytes make spores, spores are haploid, sporophytes are diploid. So in order to produce a spore, you have to go through meiosis. But because the gametophyte grows from the spores, it's already haploid. The gametophyte is already haploid. So when it goes to produce the gametes, it does it by mitosis. And this makes the alternation of generations of life cycles very different from animals. We think of our gametes as being produced by meiosis, while in plants, the gametophyte produces gametes, and it has to do it by mitosis because the gametophyte is already haploid. To get started in understanding how life cycles differ among different terrestrial plants or plants that live on land, it's often easier to start with early plants as they've moved on to land. So we talked about mosses as a group of plants that first moved on land, and they were often the ones that used strategy 1 of how to adapt to living on land. Mosses are something that people see really often. They just may not recognize that's what they're looking at. You can see the mosses in the picture of the forest at the base of all the trees. All of that very bright green plant material is actually a moss. If you move counterclockwise from that picture and look at what looks kind of like a green blob, you're kind of zooming in on that moss structure. And then if you keep going counterclockwise and you zoom in very close as if you're holding that blob in your hand, what you're looking at are little stalks with tiny leaf-like structures that do photosynthesis. On a moss, this is the gametophyte, and the moss spends the majority of its time in that gametophyte stage. So every little leaf and stalk you're looking at is made up of multiple cells. The gametophyte is multicellular, so what you're looking at there is a multicellular plant that spends the majority of its life haploid. We often call plants that spend the majority of their life haploid, or the majority of life in the gametophyte stage, gametophyte dominant. So if you hear someone say gametophyte dominant, it means that the majority of life is spent in that multicellular haploid stage. So the next thing to think about is, how then does this plant go about running through its whole life cycle? Or when does it become sporophyte? What does the sporophyte look like? How does it make gametes? All of those things fall under the life cycle. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the whole life cycle of the plant and try to orient you to the structures on the diagram while also looking at real images of that plant. Okay, the first thing I want to tell you on this particular slide, and for the majority of moss information, is that you will not have to memorize this life cycle. However, there are several structures that are analogous to what we're going to talk about in flowering plants. So even though you don't have to memorize these structures, this will make it a lot easier to think about flowering plants when we get there. So what you should see on the slide right now is the entire life cycle of the moss. It looks really complicated, so if you go ahead and click on your mouse, you'll see that the life cycle goes away, and what you're left with is the image of the mosses from the last slide, and then the cartoon-like diagram from the top of the life cycle. So when you see that image from the top of the life cycle, you know you're looking at one of those individual stalks from the photograph. All right, so if you can then think about that, what you'll notice at the top of those structures are there are two black circles surrounding parts of what we've called the gametophyte or the stalk of the gametophyte. Okay, if you go ahead and click now, what should happen is the image of the moss goes away, and what will appear are the arrows coming out of those two black circles, and then two new images, well, four new images really, showing you two different structures. These are going to be the reproductive structures of the gametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte is the structure that's making gametes. So these two structures are going to be responsible for making the egg, or the ovule, and the sperm. As you can see with the text next to this slide, the archegonium is going to be the structure that makes and contains the egg, or the ovule. And when we fertilize that egg, the embryo will grow within the archegonium. We'll talk more about that when we get to that process of fertilization. The male structure, the part that makes the sperm and releases the sperm, is called the antheridium. So they show you two diagrams of them as if you were looking at them under low magnification, and then they zoom in on the two structures, the antheridium and the archegonium. Now in lab, in order to look at the gametophyte at all, you looked at the archegonium. And I want to emphasize that that's just part of the gametophyte. It's not the whole thing. A lot of the moss does photosynthesis, does not do reproduction. So the whole gametophyte includes all of the stalk, the parts that are doing photosynthesis, and then these reproductive structures. So what you can see from this diagram is that the archegonium will contain the egg or the ovule. The antheridium will produce the sperm. Again, this occurs by mitosis. Now, if you think about the fact that these structures, every cell you're looking at is going to be haploid. So that includes the sperm, the cells that make up the archegonium, the cells that make up the antheridium. Now, I want to actually show you these when what they look like on a real plant. So in the next slide, we'll show you those. We won't go into too much detail about them, but just so you can get an idea of how different they really are. Okay, in this slide, what you can see are the structures that are called the archegonium and the antheridium on live moss plants. And really, if you're not looking for them, it might even be hard to detect these independently from the photosynthetic parts of the plant. And they're not always visible. The gametophyte is not always producing sperm and egg, but at this time of year, because it's been so wet, you could actually go out and look at mosses and see these structures starting to develop. In lab, you looked at the cross-section of the archegonium, and you can see that next to the archegonium image at the top of the slide. Now, when you think about mosses, we often kind of generalize and think of them all as the same thing, but there are many different species of mosses, and they all have these structures, but they use them differently. So in some mosses, you can find the antheridium and the archegonium on exactly the same plant. On other mosses, you may see that one plant makes the archegonium and the other one makes the antheridium. This will also be true in flowering plants, where some flowering plants make one plant that is female and one that is male. whereas others have the male and female parts on the same plant. Okay, as we return back to the life cycle diagram, we left off showing the antheridium and the archegonium producing sperm and egg. When water actually hits the antheridium, what it will do is it will cause the antheridium to release the sperm, and the sperm will then swim into the egg. And remember, in early plants, they still have flagellated sperm, so they require that water droplet so the sperm can swim from the antheridium down through into the archegonium and fertilize the egg. Fertilizing the egg results in the production of a diploid cell. So a haploid sperm comes into contact with the haploid egg. The two nuclei of these cells fuse together to form the embryo, and that makes the embryo diploid. But until that diploid cell goes through one round of mitosis, it's not multicellular yet, so we're not quite at the sporophyte stage just yet. If the embryo undergoes mitosis, however, that's when we start building the sporophyte. In this diagram, what you can see is that the embryo will start to develop on the within the archegonium, so on the gametophyte of the plant, and it will start to go through mitosis until it produces a structure called the sporangium. So if you go ahead and click, you'll see a cartoon diagram of the moss with a brown structure coming out of it. And that whole brown structure, the top, the stalk coming out of the archegonium, that's all the sporophyte. And as you click through, what you'll see is images will pop up showing you the sporophyte in a real photograph, and then also a cartoon drawing that indicates in two different ways that the sporophyte and the gametophyte are on the same plant. And this is also something I think we often think of them as completely separate, but in alternation of generations, the sporophyte and the gametophyte are often together on the plant. They're not separate plants. And you can see that really clearly here with the mosses. Now, the next part of the life cycle is the sporophyte making its reproductive structures. The structure itself, in the case of mosses, is called the sporangium. It is the structure where spores are produced. Now remember, the cells of the sporophyte have to be diploid. They're part of the sporophyte generation, so they're diploid and multicellular. But we'll have individual cells that go through meiosis to make the spores. So if you go ahead and click through, you should see that within the sporangium, the spores are going to be made by meiosis. Then when those spores are released, you'll see them start to germinate, that means to grow, and produce a whole new gametophyte by mitosis again. So again, the only meiosis part here is coming from cells within the sporangium. Okay, so when you think about the cells that are actually going to go through meiosis, you may know from what we just talked about that the cells have to be within the sporophyte and they're going to be in this structure called a sporangium, but you may not have thought about which cells are actually undergoing meiosis. So to draw parallels between plants and what you already know, I'm going to use the human male as an example. Human male meiosis is very much like what we teach you as basic meiosis, whereas female meiosis is a little bit different, and save that for when you're about reproduction in females later in the course. So I think most people recognize that meiosis is only happening within the gonads. Right? But when you get within the gonads are not all cells that are going to all of a sudden undergo meiosis. So some cells within the gonads do not go through meiosis at all. However, within the gonad in human males, there's a cell that's called the spermatocyte. So it's the spermatocyte. And the spermatocyte is a diploid cell. It'll go through meiosis 1, and you can see on the diagram that it produces something called the secondary spermatocyte from meiosis 1. And then after meiosis 2, it makes something called a spermatid. So in this case, the spermatids will then undergo a bunch of changes. They get their flagella and do a few other things to make them truly sperm, and then the sperm can be used to fertilize eggs. So in the case of human gonads, the cell that undergoes meiosis is called the spermatocyte. In plants, the equivalent cell is called a mother cell. This is fine except for the fact that when we hear the term mother, we think female, but in reality, the mother cell is any cell that can go through meiosis. To drive home the point of this mother cell, I'm showing you a very schematic diagram of how meiosis works in plants. The mother cell is a diploid cell found within the sporophyte of a plant. And it will go through the 2 rounds of meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And as a result, these structures that are produced are called spores. The mother cell goes through meiosis and will produce spores. This is going to be one of the key things that will trip up understanding how cells are produced in flowering plants. So think about the mother cell as just a diploid cell that will be one responsible for making spores. Okay, so how does the mother cell actually relate back to the life cycles that we're talking about? What you see in the image is the diagram of alternation of generations that you've seen before. And in the moss, we started out with the gametophyte. We watched the gametophyte go through mitosis to build the archegonium and the antheridium. The antheridium and the archegonium make the sperm and the egg, so the gametes, by mitosis. And then the gametes come together for fertilization. It happens within the archegonium, and it develops from the zygote to the embryo. And once that embryo is multicellular, we call it the sporophyte. The sporophyte in the moss had that large sporangium on the top, and we know that within the sporangium, we're going to make spores. So let's be specific based on what we know now, and the cell within the sporangium that we're interested in is the mother cell. So the mother cell within the sporangium will undergo meiosis and produce a spore. Then that spore can germinate and produce a new gametophyte, or the new moss structure. This process is the same in all plants in the sense that the mother cell will always produce the spore, and then that spore will develop into the gametophyte. What's going to differ across the different groups of plants is the length of time it spends in the gametophyte, where fertilization takes place, and things like that. And if we move on to the next slide, we can remind ourselves a little bit about what the actual relationship between those differences among life cycles are and the adaptations to land. As I just mentioned in the previous slide, there's going to be variation between the moss cycle, the gymnosperm life cycle, and the angiosperm life cycles. Gymnosperms, remember, they're large land plants like pine trees. They have vascular tissue. They produce cones, not fruits and flowers. So when you look at the 2 life cycles on the slide, I'm not expecting you to know those. I don't want you to know the details of them. But remember, one of the things that changes as we get better adapted to land is the length of time that plants stay in that gametophyte stage or in the sporophyte stage. So you can see just based on the color brown that the time spent in the sporophyte stage increases in gymnosperms, and it's even more dominant in angiosperms. We also see that the number of cells in the gametophyte will go down as we become better adapted to land. So in the case of the moss, it's a huge number. It's making up all of the archegonium, all the antheridium, all of the photosynthetic cells. But in pine trees and in flowering plants, the number of cells gets really, really small. The pollen grain is actually the male gametophyte in gymnosperms and angiosperms. And you're going to see that that goes from something like 8 or 9 or 10 cells in some plants to only 2 in angiosperms. So you're going to see a very drastic reduction in number of cells in the gametophyte. Now in the 2 life cycles you see on here, all of them have flagellated sperm, so they all have flagella. However, unlike mosses, we don't require that water to disperse the sperm. The sperm in gymnosperms is encapsulated by a structure called pollen, and it's primarily wind dispersed in gymnosperms. So now it doesn't need that flagella anymore, even though it has it. Okay? So that also means that the way that we get sperm to the ovule is very different. It no longer relies on water, and that's because they're better adapted to land and they're able to move away from water, so they just don't have access to it. So we see these changes happen. And then when we get really talking about those gametophytes, we actually get really down to only talking about a few cells. And so we get very specific about some details. All right, to draw another parallel between human sperm and egg and plant reproduction, there are a few things that in biology, the way that we name them is consistent across all organisms. And when we designate something male or female, it's done based on the size of the gamete. All right, so we're switching from spores to gametes for a minute just to define male and female. The large gamete is always produced by the female, and the small gamete is always produced by the male. So when you look at this image of the sperm and the egg, you can see that the sperm is much, much smaller than the egg. And so you could flip it around too. You could say, well, I found this new organism, and I think I have a male and a female. The one that produces the largest gamete, I'm going to call a female, and the one that produces the smaller gamete, I'm going to call the male. And that would fit in with a lot of biological definitions. Now that means that when we want to refer to females, we often put prefixes in front of their names. So if you see something that starts out with mega, it can often refer to the female to indicate that this is going to produce the female structures. In addition, in males, we would use a prefix called micro. So something called a megaspore might make a female gametophyte, and a microspore would make a male gametophyte. Okay, so let's tie it all together so that you guys have all of the information that you could possibly want before heading into understanding how angiosperms reproduce. Now we've talked about the life cycle and the different structures that some you saw in lab, some you didn't see in lab, and we did this from the perspective of mosses. But we know that when you move away from land or water onto land, you start to have some changes to the way the moss life cycle would work. One of the things that we see happen is a change in the size of the gametophyte, but we're also going to get some other differences that happen in angiosperm reproduction. And these are going to tie together that mega and micro idea, the mother cell idea. And so I've shown you on this slide only the part of the diagram, the generalized diagram that we need right now to focus on tying all these terms together. Some plants have male gametophytes and some plants have female gametophytes. When they're separate, that means that this one spore is going to produce a female gametophyte and one spore is going to produce a male gametophyte. And these two spores are different. They're going to come from different parts of the plant. So we need to be a little bit more specific about where they come from. And this is going to tie in that idea of micro and mega. And we'll start with the spore that produces the female gametophyte, and that's the image that you see on the slide right now. So remember, when you start with the multicellular sporophyte, which in angiosperms is going to be almost all that you will ever see. So the tree, the trunk, the flowers, that's all sporophyte. But within that sporophyte, there's going to be a cell, a single cell that goes through meiosis. Because in angiosperms we make a male gametophyte and a female gametophyte, we're going to have a separate spore that makes the female gametophyte and a different separate spore that makes the male gametophyte. So if you're in the sporophyte, you want to differentiate the mother cell that goes through meiosis to produce the female gametophyte and the mother cell that goes about producing the male gametophyte. So on this diagram that's currently on the slide, what you see is at the multicellular sporophyte stage, we still have the orange dot that indicates the mother cell, but instead of calling it just the mother cell, we call it the megaspore mother cell. Remember, mega refers to the female, and what this is describing is a cell that's going to produce a spore, and specifically, it's going to produce a spore that will grow into the female gametophyte. This spore is going to be called a megaspore. So the megaspore makes the female gametophyte, or goes through mitosis to make the female gametophyte, and the mother cell that produces the megaspore is going to be called the megaspore mother cell. So if you walk through this within the multicellular sporophyte, there's a cell, it's diploid. It's called the megaspore mother cell. It goes through meiosis, and its product is the megaspore. That megaspore is going to grow into the female gametophyte. And you know this because it has that prefix, or the beginning of the word is mega. That female gametophyte will then go through mitosis and produce the ovule or the egg. All right, so if you walk through that one more time, you know that on the multicellular sporophyte, or within the multicellular sporophyte, you have a cell called the megaspore mother cell. It's a mother cell, so it's going to go through meiosis. But since it's a megaspore mother cell, it produces a megaspore. Megaspores will then go through mitosis and produce the female gametophyte. The female gametophyte can then go through mitosis and make the egg or the ovule. Okay, that makes sense. This is the one that's intuitive. If you click, we're going to then look at what happens in the male. All right, within the sporophyte, again, you have a sporophyte, so it's multicellular and diploid. And somewhere within that sporophyte, there is a cell called the microspore mother cell. Now remember, I told you mega refers to female and micro refers to male. Right? So with the term microspore, it makes sense. Right? A microspore grows into the male gametophyte. What's weird about the terminology here is that there's a mother cell with the term micro, and we think of mother as female and micro as male, and things get confusing. So when you see the term microspore mother cell, what we're saying is this is the cell that's going to go through meiosis to produce the structure called the microspore. So you can ignore the fact that mother has female connotations here, and instead think about the fact that the mother cell is something that goes through meiosis. So within the multicellular sporophyte, you have a microspore mother cell. That microspore mother cell is going to go through meiosis. After meiosis, it produces a structure called the microspore. That prefix microspore, or microspore, is micro, so that means that once it goes through mitosis, it's going to produce the male gametophyte. The male gametophyte will then go through mitosis and make sperm. So one more time, in the case of a male part of a plant, the multicellular sporophyte is the large part of the plant. It's diploid and multicellular. One of its cells that's also diploid is called the microspore mother cell. The microspore mother cell goes through meiosis to produce microspores. The microspores then go through mitosis to make the male gametophyte, and then the male gametophyte can go through mitosis to make sperm. All right, so when you talk about these two things, the female gametophyte in angiosperms is going to be called the embryo sac, and the male gametophyte is going to be called pollen. And we'll get to that on Monday, and hopefully these terms and practicing this will help you understand how angiosperms reproduce.